I now give the floor to Ms. Lisa Doughten. You have the floor, madam.
Thank you, Mr. President. When we last briefed the Council on April 11th, we informed you that Ukraine was enduring some of the worst attacks since the start of this war. Since then, attacks on Ukraine have only escalated further. Relentless hostilities continue in communities along the northeastern border with the Russian Federation and on the front line. Several waves of attacks in the Kharkiv region over the past few days have caused the death and injury of numerous civilians, including children. Just today, the city of Kharkiv, Ukraine's second largest city, was struck again, injuring at least 15 civilians. They have also led to the massive destruction of civilian infrastructure, a trend I'll come to in more detail in a moment. These attacks have triggered yet more displacement from border and frontline communities. As of today, authorities report that over 7,000 civilians were evacuated from border areas of the Kharkiv region, and they have had devastating consequences for civilians who remain in those areas, with many cut off from access to food, medical care, electricity, and gas. People in Donetsk and Sumy regions in the east and north of the country were also impacted by attacks in recent days, with homes and civilian infrastructure damaged. In total, the Office for the High Commissioner for Human Rights, OCHA, recorded more than 700 civilian casualties across Ukraine in April. 129 civilians were killed, while 574 were injured, a significant increase in the number of civilians injured for the second month in a row. 90% of all civilian casualties occurred in Ukrainian-controlled territory. Strikes have also been reported inside the Russian Federation, including on Sunday in the Belgorod region, reportedly also resulting in several civilian casualties and damage to residential homes and other civilian infrastructure. Mr. President, across Ukraine, we have also seen an intensified pattern of attacks on civilian infrastructure with far-reaching humanitarian consequences. Since March 22nd of this year, the UN and its partners have seen 5 waves of attacks directed against Ukraine's energy infrastructure. OCHA recorded 50 such incidents in April alone. Kharkiv and Dnipro regions are particularly affected, with Ukraine's energy ministry reporting up to 250,000 residents experiencing rolling power outages in Kharkiv and ongoing restrictions in Dnipro since March. These attacks have destroyed or damaged power generation plants and electricity substations. The impact of these power cuts on the most vulnerable is stark. They have temporarily left millions of households across the country with no power, no water, and no gas needed for cooking, heating, hygiene, and other vital services. Children who rely on online schooling are not able to learn. Older persons with mobility impairments, persons with disabilities who use wheelchairs or other assisted devices, and mothers with small children are unable to leave multi-story apartment buildings to access food and medical support. Mr. President, we're extremely worried by what appears to be a new pattern of attacks on railway infrastructure in the east and south of Ukraine. In April alone, OCHA recorded 10 attacks on railway infrastructure in government-controlled territory. The attacks killed 16 civilians and injured 59 more. Damage to the railway system also prevents the movement of people, goods such as construction material and other essential supplies. Also concerning are the attacks on factories and production plants, limiting the availability of locally procured humanitarian goods. In addition, continuing attacks on Ukraine's port infrastructure threaten their ability to export grain and other agricultural commodities at a time when the number of people facing acute food insecurity around the world continues to rise year after year. And we're alarmed by reports of attacks damaging energy infrastructure and oil refineries in the Russian Federation. Such attacks risk inflaming the war further and worsening its humanitarian impacts. I'm compelled once again to recall that under international humanitarian law, the parties must take constant care to spare all civilians, as well as civilian objects, including homes, schools, hospitals, and other essential infrastructure. Mr. President, the intensification in hostilities is making the delivery of humanitarian assistance all the more dangerous. Nevertheless, the UN and its humanitarian partners are doing everything we can to reach people in need of support, despite the enormous risks. Across the country, as of the end of March this year, 3.6 million people have received some form of humanitarian assistance. So far this year, a dozen interagency convoys delivered vital supplies to 20,000 people in frontline areas. Local humanitarian partners have been instrumental in conducting last-mile delivery and distribution. Assistance has also included the delivery of healthcare services to nearly 860,000 people, maintenance support for water and wastewater systems for more than 1.7 million people, and emergency water supplies for more than 1.2 million people. 2 million people have received food, seed, and livestock support, while around 580,000 people have been helped with essential household supplies and materials for emergency home repairs. Humanitarian protection activities have been expanded, including gender-based violence support for people newly displaced by the hostilities. We commend the government of Ukraine for the additional support it has announced for survivors of conflict-related sexual violence in the form of financial reparations and medical and psychological assistance. We're also incredibly grateful to donors who have so far provided 22% of the $3.1 billion needed for the Ukraine humanitarian needs and response plan. We call on donors to provide immediate and flexible financial support, which is so urgently needed to respond to the ever-growing needs. Mr. President, another challenge remains reaching civilians in the areas of Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia that are currently under the occupation of the Russian Federation. We're deeply concerned about the estimated 1.5 million people in need of life-saving assistance in these areas. As we said in last month's briefing and repeatedly in this council, in accordance with international humanitarian law, all parties must allow and facilitate the rapid and unimpeded passage of humanitarian relief for civilians in need. They must ensure that humanitarian personnel have the freedom of movement required for their work. I renew my call to the parties to comply with the obligations in this regard. Mr. President, this war has caused the death and injury of tens of thousands of people in Ukraine. It has displaced millions, many of whom continue to seek refuge in neighboring countries and across the world. It has caused immense suffering and left more than 14 million people, or 40% of the population, in need of humanitarian assistance. We once again call on this council to seek an end to it. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Ms. Doughten for her briefing.